Danielle Harper and her 7-year-old daughter Amira boarded Flight 227 from Atlanta to New York with hopes for a peaceful journey. Danielle had carefully booked 2 first-class seats near the front, row 3. Seats A and B, specifically to prevent Amira from getting motion sickness and to give herself a bit of comfort before an important presentation. But more importantly, they were flying to visit Danielle's grandfather, Colonel Samuel Harper, a 94-year-old former decorated fighter pilot who was now tethered to an oxygen tank. Amira had never met him, and Danielle, despite many years of delay, had finally decided to make the trip after getting a call from his nurse urging her to come soon. Amira wore a bright yellow dress that lit up the cabin like bottled sunshine, her beaded braids bouncing with each step, and she held tightly to her worn-out stuffed giraffe named Buttons. Though Amira remained blissfully unaware of the curious glances directed their way. Danielle felt him all too well. As the only 2 black passengers in first class, Danielle could easily read the unspoken judgments that filled the air, the kind of silent questioning that implied they didn't belong. Still, she stayed composed, placing their carry-on in the overhead bin and helping Amira settle into her window seat, where the little girl excitedly pressed her face against the glass, eager to spot clouds shaped like elephants. As Danielle opened her tablet to review work notes, her thoughts drifted not to marketing strategies but to her grandfather, one of the legendary Tuskegee Airmen who had survived both aerial battles and the war of discrimination at home. She remembered her grandmother's words, "Sam Harper didn't just fight enemies in the sky. He fought America's blindness every time he took off." Just then, a tall white flight attendant with a practiced, icy smile named Ashley approached. She politely asked if Danielle and Amira would be willing to move to allow another family to sit together. The new seats would be in row 26, near the bathrooms. Danielle's stomach tightened. She knew what this was. Calmly, she explained that she'd booked the seats in advance because Amira suffers from motion sickness and needs to sit near the front. Ashley's response, that the other family had medical needs and their child had to be close to the lavatory, yet all the seats up front were already occupied by premium passengers. Danielle, trying to stay composed, asked, "What exactly are we?" Then, the implication was painfully clear. Moments later, Ashley returned with a paper in hand and a thin smile, again urging Danielle to move to row 26. Danielle repeated herself. Her daughter needed to stay near the front. And she wasn't moving. The pressure increased. Ashley emphasized how helpful it would be if Danielle cooperated and added a passive-aggressive note that it's always appreciated when passengers are understanding. Danielle, a professional who had faced this type of dressed-up discrimination before, didn't flinch. "I am being considerate," she replied firmly, "to my child, and to the money I paid to be here." Ashley then tried other passengers, row 6, row 7, but no one agreed to switch. Returning again, she admitted that no one else was willing. Danielle's refusal became a target. From behind her, a white man muttered that he wouldn't want to sit next to a noisy kid either. Amira, who had been quiet the entire time, whispered, "I am quiet. I haven't even said anything." Danielle gently rested her hand on her daughter's knee. Without saying a word, she told her daughter, "You are not the problem." The space around them became thick with tension. Danielle could feel the coded language, the false politeness, the unspoken accusation, "You're taking up space we didn't expect you to take." When Ashley came back once more, Danielle stood her ground. She wasn't moving, and when Ashley said, "We're doing our best to accommodate everyone," Danielle interrupted, "You mean no one else has to switch?" The implication hung in the air. They weren't just being asked, they were being targeted. From behind, another passenger whispered disdainfully, "Why does this always have to turn into something with people like that?" The phrase pierced the moment like a blade. Amira, her small voice trembling with painful understanding, finally asked the question that stopped time in the cabin. "Mommy, is it because we're black?" The silence that followed was louder than any scream. The cabin froze, and the story, one that started with kindness, preparation, and a yellow dress, turned into something much heavier. Danielle looked at her daughter with steel in her eyes and said softly, "Yes, baby, I think that might be part of it." When Amira softly asked, "Is it because we're black?" the cabin descended into a heavy, electrified silence, an unsettling stillness that cut through the hum of the plane like a thunderclap. Even the man behind them who had made the earlier comment went still. A flight attendant paused mid-checklist at the front of the cabin. Eyes darted, but no one spoke. Danielle didn't immediately answer. Instead, she reached out, gently moved a braid from her daughter's forehead, and then, with quiet strength, confirmed what she wished she didn't have to. "Yes, baby, I think that might be part of it." At that moment, a woman across the cabin, black, older, silent until now, caught Danielle's eye and gave a slow, solemn nod, the kind that carried decades of shared pain and unspoken understanding. Danielle's heart pounded, not from fear but from the exhausting familiarity of the moment, from the fury she had to swallow. She couldn't afford to be seen as the angry black woman on a plane. She had to be calm, composed, dignified, even while being targeted. Amira, visibly trying to make sense of the moment, asked in a trembling voice if she had done something wrong. Danielle's heart nearly broke, but her voice remained steady as she reassured her daughter, "No, sweetheart. You were perfect. You are always perfect." Just then, Ashley returned, this time not alone. With her stood a tall, older woman in a crisp navy uniform and a tight bun, clearly the one in charge. Her name tag read Marjorie Kane, and her demeanor suggested she was used to obedience. Without greeting, Marjorie began formally, stating that Danielle's refusal to relocate was hindering the crew's efforts to accommodate a family with medical needs. Danielle, still seated with poise, clarified that she wasn't refusing, merely staying in the seats she had paid for to ensure her child didn't get sick. Marjorie's tone sharpened, warning that refusal could be escalated. Danielle, unmoved, asked whether this was FAA regulation or simply a selective policy used to displace passengers when it was inconvenient. The question landed with weight. Marjorie didn't respond directly. Instead, she began to write something down. Noting the refusal, Danielle, calm but firm, asked if they planned to call security or just write up the black woman who said no. The tension rippled across the rows. Whispers began. A woman leaned forward, eyes wide. Still, no one stood up. Marjorie, unfazed, instructed Ashley to try the other rows again. But moments later, Ashley returned empty-handed. No one else was willing to move. Some said they weren't comfortable. She added quietly. Danielle repeated the word, comfortable, tasting the irony. Then she asked why the family in need couldn't sit in the back. Marjorie replied that they had purchased first-class tickets and these were the only seats available to keep them together. Danielle then asked, "And we're not premium?" Marjorie blinked but didn't answer. She didn't have to. A man muttered under his breath. Why does this always have to turn into something with people like that? The weight of those words sat heavy in the air, unchallenged by others. Amir turned again to her mother, asking in earnest, "Why do they want us to move so bad? We got here first." Danielle leaned in, gently touching her daughter's cheek and assuring her, "It's okay, baby, we're staying right here." Then, with more clarity and courage than most adults, Amira raised her voice just enough for the cabin to hear, "Is it because we're black?" The world stopped. A businessman froze mid-scroll. A woman lowered her book. A child stopped kicking the seat in front. Even Ashley looked like she wanted to vanish. Marjorie's pen hovered over her pad. Suddenly unsure, Danielle didn't look at either woman. She only looked at her daughter, heart aching, and answered gently, "Yes, baby, that might be part of it." The atmosphere shifted. This time, it wasn't just tense, it was revealing. From the back of the plane, a black woman in her 60s locked eyes with Danielle. Her expression filled with empathy and memory. She didn't say a word, but her slow nod said everything. Danielle clutched her daughter's hand, holding on to both strength and grace, knowing full well how dignity must often be worn like armor. Then, finally, Marjorie returned, this time alone. Her expression noticeably changed, Gone was the cold detachment. Now. Her voice was flatter, almost tentative. "I'll need your name," she said. Danielle didn't flinch. "Elise Holloway," she replied. "And my daughter is Amira Holloway." Marjorie paused, her pen suddenly still. "Holloway?" she repeated, the name catching in her throat. Then again, slower, "Colonel Franklin Holloway." Danielle nodded, confused. "Yes, that's my grandfather." And just like that, Marjorie's entire demeanor transformed. Her back straightened, her eyes widened. She asked, hesitatingly, "Is he still with us?" Danielle replied that he was, and that they were flying to New York to see him, perhaps for the last time. Marjorie's hands trembled slightly. She looked down, visibly shaken. "Colonel Holloway saved my brother's life," she said, recounting a mission in 1945 over eastern France when Danielle's grandfather and his unit had protected her brother's plane under fire. Danielle was stunned. She'd grown up hearing whispers of her grandfather's heroism, but to hear it now from a stranger made it real. Marjorie stepped back, her voice almost reverent. "These passengers will remain in their assigned seats," she told Ashley firmly. "No further action is necessary." Ashley opened her mouth but thought better of it. Marjorie added, more gently now, "Let us know if there's anything you or your daughter need." Then, quietly, just to Danielle, "Your grandfather is a hero. I'm deeply sorry for how this was handled." Danielle nodded once, her silence carrying more weight than words. Ashley lingered, no apology in her eyes, just discomfort. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" she asked. Danielle answered simply, "No, we're fine." The drive from LaGuardia Airport to Harlem passed in a blur of gray buildings and fading evening light as Danielle sat quietly beside her daughter in the backseat of a cab. Watching the city stretch and shift like a living memory, Amira pressed her face to the window, animated again, counting bridges and yellow cabs, humming softly and tapping her fingers on the stuffed giraffe in her lap. But Danielle couldn't shake the weight of the flight, the confrontation, the quiet violence of assumptions, and how the simple power of a name had turned the tide. It unsettled her, not because it had ended in their favor, but because it had required history, legacy, and heroism to justify something so basic, the right to remain where you belong. As the cab turned onto a familiar street lined with brownstones and flower pots, Danielle saw her grandfather's home at the end of the block, still sturdy and unchanged, a monument to endurance. A woman in her 30s stepped onto the stoop as they arrived, casual in jeans and a sweater, introducing herself as Talia, the home nurse. She smiled warmly, telling them that Franklin had been asking about them all day. Danielle stepped inside the house, instantly enveloped by the familiar scent of lemon polish and old paper, a childhood memory wrapped in a sensory echo. The walls were still lined with framed photos, proud black men in uniform, radiant women in Sunday dresses, snapshots of milestones and resilience. In the living room, Franklin sat in a leather chair by the window, thinner than Danielle remembered, with oxygen tubing in his nose and a cane at his side. But his eyes, sharp and alert, still burned with life. "Elise," he rasped, voice low but strong, "come here and let me see you." She stepped forward, momentarily a child again, then guided Amira into view. Franklin's face softened, and he extended a slow hand. Amira placed her small one in his. "Bright eyes," he whispered. "You got your mama's eyes." Danielle knelt beside them, her voice catching as she said, "I'm sorry it took so long." But Franklin gently waved it off. "You're here now. That's what matters." The room filled with quiet comfort, the kind that required no explanations. Then Amira, never one to hold back, declared, "We had trouble on the plane. The lady tried to move us. But then she didn't when she heard Mommy's last name." Franklin raised a brow, and Danielle nodded, explaining that one of the attendants had recognized his name, said he'd saved her brother's life in 1945. Franklin leaned back in the chair, eyes drifting out the window. "Happened more than once," he said quietly. "Most of them never remembered our names after." He didn't need details to understand what had happened. The shape of the story was all too familiar. He placed one calloused hand on Danielle's shoulder, a gesture of unspoken strength. And in that moment, decades of shared history passed between him: pride, sorrow, resilience. Amira, wide-eyed, asked if he had really been a pilot. I was. He smiled. A long time ago. Mommy says you're a hero, she said. Franklin chuckled. Your mommy says a lot of things. But Danielle's eyes remained locked on him, studying the man who had once flown through fire for a country that never quite knew how to thank him. He had always stood tall. But now, worn by time, he still held his dignity like a shield. As the sun dipped low, casting golden beams across the living room, Franklin began to speak of the war, not just the one with bombs and bullets, but the other war, the quieter one they fought at home. They didn't even let us use the front door of the base cafeteria, he said. Medals on our chests. Danielle clenched her jaw, the pain sharp. You were willing to die for this country, she said, and they still treated you like less than human. Franklin nodded. GI Bill didn't cover us. My buddy flew more missions than any white pilot I knew, ended up mopping floors in Georgia. Silence followed, heavy but honest. Danielle whispered, I thought things had changed. My title, my salary, my daughter's school. I thought we'd left that world behind. Franklin looked at her gently. You've come far, he said, but don't mistake distance for arrival. Then he said what Danielle had always known but rarely heard aloud. We fought 2 wars. One overseas, and one right here. And the second one, it's still going. Amira asked innocently, but I thought the war ended a long time ago. Franklin bent to her level, his voice gentle but firm. I'm not talking about planes, baby. I'm talking about the war for respect. For the right to walk into a room and not have to explain why you belong. Danielle thought of that flight, how she had to stand her ground just to remain seen. I've spent my whole career trying to prove I earned my seat, she said. Franklin nodded. They teach us to be twice as good. Smile more, speak less, and when we succeed, they treat it like a gift instead of what we deserve. Then turning to Amira, he said, but you won't fight like we did. You'll fight with truth, with your voice, with knowing where you come from. Amira beamed. I come from a pilot. And Franklin laughed, soft and full. That night, Danielle watched as her daughter listened to her great-grandfather tell stories from an old journal. And when an email popped up offering her a senior director role in Atlanta, she stared at the glowing screen, then quietly declined. She chose to stay in New York, close to family, close to the stories that needed telling, because she finally realized, legacy isn't what's behind you, it's what you live out loud. The transition to staying in New York wasn't instantaneous. But once Danielle sent the email declining the senior director offer in Atlanta, there was a calm certainty in her chest that hadn't been there before. Over the following weeks, her company arranged a lateral move to their Manhattan office, not as glamorous, not as high-paying, but it kept her close to what truly mattered. Amira transferred to a magnet school in Harlem with a visual arts program that made her glow from the inside out. Each day she came home with stories bursting from her lips and paint smudges on her fingers. Her creativity unfolding like spring. Franklin, too, seemed to come alive in ways no one expected, his posture straighter, his voice stronger, as if being seen and remembered somehow breathed new strength into his tired body. Then, one afternoon, Amira came home and said something simple but powerful. My friends didn't know who the Tuskegee Airmen were. I told them my great-grandpa flew one of the red planes. But they thought I was making it up. Danielle and Franklin exchanged a look, one of recognition and resolve. And Franklin, without hesitation, said, well, maybe it's time we show them. And so began a labor of love, memory, and healing. Together, the three of them dove into boxes long stored in attics and closets. Unearthing photos, flight maps, medals, old letters, and yellowed clippings, artifacts of a life spent soaring through history and yet too often ignored by it. Danielle scanned and catalogued everything with meticulous care, organizing timelines and stories, while Amira, with her childlike brilliance, designed posters filled with stars, wings, and captions that radiated pride. Franklin, on the days he felt strong enough, sat with them at the dining table, telling stories he had kept inside for decades, of flying under enemy fire, of escorting bomber squadrons safely home, and of landing in his own country only to be told to use the back door. There was no bitterness in his voice, only truth, and an unyielding desire to ensure the next generation understood. The project grew organically, transforming from a school presentation into something far larger. They titled it, Red Tails, Black Legacy, the Tuskegee Airmen and the War at Home, a name that honored both the aerial battles abroad and the silent battles waged in American streets and mines. The local library offered a small corner for display, followed by an invitation from Amira's school to exhibit for an entire week. Parents stopped by, wide-eyed and emotional. Teachers lingered longer than they had planned, reading each caption, asking questions they never thought to ask before. One day, a museum educator visited the exhibit and suggested expanding it to a broader audience, perhaps something permanent, something mobile. Danielle was surprised by how fast it had all grown. But Franklin wasn't. "This was never about me," he said one evening. "It's about making sure our people know we were there, that we fought, and that we still are." Amira added her final touch to the display, a hand-drawn sketch of herself in her yellow dress standing beside her great-grandfather. Both smiling, both proud. Above the drawing, in uneven but bold handwriting, she wrote, "He flew so I could stand." Danielle had to look away to stop the tears from spilling. And just like that, history came alive, not in textbooks or memorials, but in living rooms, in hallways, in the bright eyes of a little girl who refused to let legacy be forgotten. Months passed with a quiet rhythm: work, school, storytelling, building, connecting, and in that stillness, Danielle realized something profound. Legacy isn't a relic stored in glass. It's not just medals or titles or pages in history books. It's a choice, daily, deliberate, and deeply human. It's how we speak up when we're told to sit down, how we stay seated when others want to move us out of sight. It's the way we carry the names, stories, and scars of those who came before us, not as burdens but as torches. And in choosing to stay, in New York, in that seat on the plane, in the moments when silence would have been easier, Danielle understood she was finally living that legacy out loud. By the time the exhibition opened at Amira's school, the air buzzed with a kind of anticipation that felt sacred. Amira wore her yellow dress again, this time not out of habit or convenience but by choice, like donning armor woven from pride and history. She stood beside her great-grandfather in the library, pointing to maps, answering questions from curious students, radiating a confidence that seemed older than her 7 years. Franklin, in his wheelchair but upright and dignified, greeted children and teachers alike, offering small stories and soft chuckles, never once drawing attention to his fatigue. Danielle stood at a quiet distance, watching the two of them, her daughter, glowing with purpose, and her grandfather, a man who had flown through fire, now finally being seen for the hero he had always been. It struck her then how life had folded past and future into a single moment. And she felt something click into place, like her heart finding rhythm again. As the week went on, the exhibit continued to draw crowds, parents, educators, even local veterans, all stopping to read, to listen, to remember. A teacher commented that she'd never seen students so engaged with history. And one child told Amira, wide-eyed, "I didn't know black people were pilots back then. That's so cool." The innocence of the comment didn't offend, it inspired. Amira beamed, saying proudly, "My great-grandpa flew one of the red planes so I could stand tall today." Danielle overheard that and had to step into the hallway for a breath. Because sometimes the simplest truths carried the heaviest weight. At home, their rhythm continued, dinner conversations filled with laughter and memory, school projects that now included My Hero pages with photos of Franklin in uniform. Danielle watched the bond between her daughter and grandfather grow deeper, more rooted, like generations shaking hands across time. Franklin would say things like, "She reminds me of you when you were little, full of fire and always asking questions." And Danielle would smile, her eyes warm with memory. One morning, as Amira stood at the door waiting for her school bus, yellow dress swishing gently, Franklin watched from the hallway and said softly, "She shines, doesn't she?" Danielle nodded. "She always has." He smiled, lines deepening at the corners of his eyes. "You did too. Your mother used to say that. Said the world gave you too many shadows. So you had to shine." He reached out and rested a hand on Danielle's shoulder. The same grounding touch he'd offered that first night. It didn't need words. On the final day of the school exhibit, Amira gave a small speech during morning assembly. Nervous but determined, she told her classmates that history isn't just in books, it's in people. In stories. In names. "My great-grandpa flew through the sky to protect others," she said, "but when he came home, they still didn't treat him right. That's why we have to remember. So it doesn't happen again." The applause that followed was soft at first, then grew like a wave, students clapping, teachers nodding, and Danielle holding her breath with pride. Later that evening, Danielle sat at the kitchen table, watching Amira sketch a new drawing, this time of herself holding a microphone, speaking on a stage. Franklin watching from the front row. "Is this what you want to do when you grow up?" Danielle asked gently. Amira nodded. "I want to tell stories. Like great-grandpas. Ones people forget." Danielle reached over and touched her daughter's hand. "Then you already know more than most." In the days that followed, Franklin's energy began to fade. His stories shorter, his voice quieter, but his eyes, those eyes, remained bright whenever Amira walked into the room. One afternoon, Danielle sat with him by the window as the sun poured in golden and still. "She's going to be all right," she said softly. Franklin didn't answer with words, just gave a slow nod, his hand wrapping around hers, thin but firm. And then, as if sensing the moment needed something more, he whispered, "You carried this further than I ever could." Danielle blinked back tears. "Only because you lifted us first." When the time finally came, when the house grew quiet and the leather chair by the window stood empty, Danielle found Amira sitting silently beside it, her stuffed giraffe in her lap. "He flew so I could stand," she whispered to herself. Danielle knelt down and hugged her tight, their shadows long against the golden floor. And in that embrace, grief and gratitude held hands. Because some legacies are not written, they're lived. Passed hand to hand, story to story, until the light they carried spreads wide enough for a little girl in a yellow dress to walk boldly into a world still learning to see her. After Franklin passed, the house felt quieter, not in sound but in spirit. Like something steady had shifted. Danielle moved through the days with deliberate grace, managing the details of his passing while holding space for Amira's grief, which came in waves, sudden silences, bursts of questions, long moments spent sitting by the now empty chair by the window. But even as the sorrow lingered, so did something else, an energy, a purpose, a sense that his story wasn't ending, only changing form. Danielle and Amira continued the work they had started with him, now with a different kind of urgency, fueled not by memory alone, but by a promise to keep him alive through the telling. The exhibition was expanded, made mobile, and began traveling across local schools, community centers, and even a small museum in Brooklyn. Each new location brought new faces, children wide-eyed with curiosity, elders wiping tears, and teachers thanking them for sharing what history books never had. Amira became the unofficial spokesperson of the exhibit, stepping into her voice with the kind of confidence Danielle had only dared to dream for her. She told the story of her great-grandfather with reverence, but not sadness, more like pride wearing a bright yellow dress. One morning, before heading to school, Amira adjusted her backpack, looked in the mirror, and said, "I think I want to be a writer. Or a pilot. Maybe both." Danielle smiled, brushing her daughter's braid behind her ear. "Whatever you choose, baby." Just make sure you fly. Later that evening, as Danielle sat alone by the kitchen window with a cup of tea, she thought back to that day on the plane, the humiliation, the defiance, the silence that had tried to shrink her, and how, in a moment of quiet resistance, she had simply said no. How that no had been enough. Not just for her, but for her daughter. That memory had once stung with anger. Now it shimmered with meaning. It had become the catalyst for everything that followed, for staying, for speaking, for standing. She realized then that her strength hadn't been inherited. It had been chosen. Chosen in every hard moment she didn't walk away from. In every conversation where she insisted on being seen. In every story she now helped her daughter tell. And Amira, this bright, beautiful girl with fire in her voice and sunlight in her stride, was the living legacy of all of it. Months passed in seasons of purpose. The exhibition gained attention from regional media. A journalist wrote an article titled, "She Wore Yellow So We'd Remember," and requests poured in for interviews. Guest speaking events, school partnerships. Danielle, once hesitant to center herself, found courage in Amira's fearlessness. Together, they stood at podiums, in classrooms, and on library steps, telling not just Franklin's story, but the deeper truth, that visibility is a right, not a reward, that dignity doesn't have to be earned, it should be honored. One day, standing before a group of high school students, Amira told them, "Sometimes people won't make space for you. That's okay, you take it anyway. You stand tall, and you speak loud, and you remember where you come from." And Danielle, listening from the sidelines, felt something deep inside her break open and bloom. This was the girl who once whispered, "Did I do something wrong?" on a plane. Now she was teaching others how to be unmovable. That night, as they walked home beneath the Harlem streetlights, Amira reached for Danielle's hand and said, "Do you think great-grandpa would be proud?" Danielle squeezed her fingers gently, voice thick with love. "He is." Every second, they walked the rest of the way in silence. But it was the kind of silence that felt full, not empty. A silence made of everything they had lived, lost, and reclaimed. The apartment was filled with warmth that night, old photos framed on new walls. Pieces of Franklin's life folded into their own. And just before bed, Amira taped her newest drawing to the fridge. A girl in a pilot's jacket standing on a runway. Arms wide open, the sky behind her endless. Above it, in bold marker, she'd written, "Because he flew, I will rise." Danielle stood before it for a long time, hand pressed to her chest, feeling not just the ache of loss, but the miracle of continuation. Legacy, she had come to understand, isn't just about what we leave behind, it's about what we build forward. And with each step her daughter took, with each word spoken in truth, with each act of grace in the face of resistance, that legacy didn't just live, it soared. In the days that followed the final exhibit, Danielle found herself reflecting more often on the yellow dress, not just as a piece of clothing Amira loved, but as a symbol that had woven itself into their story. Bright and stubborn like hope refusing to dim, the yellow dress had witnessed moments of injustice, of pride, of quiet defiance and thunderous truth. It had moved through the aisle of a plane where their presence was questioned and into classrooms where their story was honored. It had become more than fabric, it was a statement, a light that walked into rooms where shadows lingered, a reminder that joy and dignity can coexist even in the face of dismissal. Danielle realized that for Amira, the dress was never about standing out for attention, it was about standing firm in identity, in joy, in visibility, and maybe, Danielle thought, that was the most radical act of all, to shine without apology. One afternoon, while organizing materials from the exhibit, Danielle found a folded piece of paper Amira had tucked into a folder. On it was another drawing. This one of a seat on an airplane. In the seat sat a girl in a yellow dress, calm, looking out the window. Above it, Amira had written, "Light belongs in every seat." The words struck Danielle in the chest. So simple yet so profound. As if her daughter had taken all the pain of that flight, all the unsaid tension, and turned it into something that radiated truth. That was what they had done. What they continued to do: turn silence into story, wounds into witness, legacy into light. Danielle remembered how that flight had nearly broken her resolve. How the weight of being seen yet not accepted had threatened to steal something from both her and Amira. But instead of folding, they had stayed. They had remained in their seats. They had claimed their place. And in doing so, they had opened the door for something bigger: a reckoning, a remembering, a rerouting of history. Danielle often thought about how many others had been asked to move, off planes, out of conversations, away from opportunity, and how many had done so quietly, without protest, carrying that injustice silently. But not this time. This time, the story had been told. This time, it echoed. That, she believed, was the power of presence, of saying no, of choosing to remain where you have every right to be. On the anniversary of Franklin's passing, Danielle, Amira, and a small circle of family and friends gathered in the local library where the exhibit had first begun. The space was different now, larger, expanded, permanent. A section named the Holloway Legacy Room had been added in honor of Franklin and the ongoing impact of their family's work. Amira, now a year older and even more eloquent, stood at the front in her yellow dress once again. She spoke not just of her great-grandfather, but of what he represented: courage, dignity, the refusal to disappear. Her voice carried through the room like a soft, strong drumbeat, steady, unwavering, full of light. Danielle stood in the back, watching her daughter shine with the quiet power of someone who knows exactly where she comes from. That night, back home, Amira curled up beside Danielle on the couch, her voice drowsy but curious. "Mommy," she asked, "do you think my dress really made a difference?" Danielle wrapped an arm around her, smiling. "Baby, that dress carried more than color. It carried you. And you made the difference." Amira nodded. Content. Outside, the city glowed with the hum of lives moving forward. And inside, mother and daughter sat wrapped in a silence that wasn't empty, but full of stories, of ancestors, of voices that once went unheard now echoing with pride. Danielle closed her eyes and let herself feel it all: the grief, the gratitude, the fierce, unrelenting love that had built every part of this journey. And as she held her daughter close, she understood something deeply true: the world may still try to dim certain lights, to push certain names to the back, to erase or ignore, but it only takes one bright thread, one yellow dress, one little girl, one story told with honesty, for that darkness to crack. And once the light gets in, it does not leave. It grows, it leads, it stays. Months after the exhibit became a permanent fixture in the community, Danielle found herself sitting once again in the living room, sunlight pouring in through the same windows that had framed Franklin's chair for so many years. The house felt different now, quieter, but not hollow. It was filled with something richer, something that hummed with presence, with memory, with the continued rhythm of a life that had never really ended, only expanded. The photographs on the walls still smiled back at her: uniforms, medals, family dinners, hand-drawn crayon portraits of planes and heroes, and Danielle understood that time didn't erase people like her grandfather, it repurposed them. Every speech Amira gave, every child who walked through the Holloway Legacy Room, every time someone paused and said, "I didn't know," was another way Franklin lived on. One evening, after a long day of work and school, Amira climbed into Danielle's lap with a worn book about aviation and asked, "Do you think I'll ever fly one of those?" Danielle didn't hesitate. "I think you'll do more than that. I think you'll fly in ways none of us ever imagined." Because she knew, Amira wasn't just learning to fly in the sky. She was already soaring through the expectations and boundaries that had once clipped generations before her. And Danielle had made sure of it. She had chosen, again and again, to stay seated, to speak when silence was easier, to tell the stories history had tried to forget. And through that choice, she had shifted not just her path, but her daughter's, and perhaps, quietly, the world's. The local school district reached out to request a traveling version of the exhibit. And Danielle, once hesitant to be at the front of any stage, found herself coordinating events, giving interviews, and mentoring young girls who looked at a mirror and saw possibility. She often spoke not with grandeur but with clarity, about the day on the plane. About the quiet strength required to say no. About how even something as simple as a child's dress could become a beacon. And through it all, the yellow dress remained, washed, patched, carefully folded when not worn, but always ready. It had become a symbol in its own right, a soft banner of resistance and radiance. A reminder that light doesn't ask for permission. One afternoon, Danielle opened an envelope from the Smithsonian. Inside was a letter inviting her and Amira to contribute items from Franklin's story to a new exhibit on untold histories of American heroism. They wanted the photographs, some of his journals, and, if possible, the yellow dress. Danielle sat with the letter for a long time, fingers tracing the words, heart full of both pride and hesitation. That night, she told Amira, expecting maybe some reluctance, but her daughter simply nodded and said, "As long as they know it's not just about what he did. It's about who we are." And Danielle smiled, because somehow, this little girl understood what had taken her a lifetime to learn. That legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about remembering who you are even when others forget. The dress was sent a week later, accompanied by a handwritten note from Amira that read, "This dress saw my truth. Please take care of it." And in that moment, Danielle felt something settle in her, a quiet certainty that they had done something that mattered. Not just for Franklin, not just for themselves, but for every little black girl who had ever been asked to move. To quiet down, to shrink. They had carved out space. They had refused invisibility. They had flown. As spring approached, Amira stood taller, spoke louder, and dreamed bigger. She started writing her own stories, drawing comics where brown girls flew planes and led missions, where grandfathers were war heroes and granddaughters wore sunlight. And Danielle, watching her from the doorway one evening, thought back to the moment on the plane, when everything could have gone differently. She thought about how the world had tried to make them small, and how, with one name and one unwavering truth, they had chosen to stay. And now, here they were, not just seated, but rising, because sometimes legacy isn't a statue or a holiday or a chapter in a textbook. Sometimes legacy is a girl in a yellow dress, standing in the light, refusing to move, and that, Danielle knew deep in her bones, was more than enough.